Welcome back. Today we're looking at a piece based on an interview with Walter Bingham. He's a 102-year-old Holocaust survivor, and he's making some really stark connections between 1930s Germany and today.
Yeah, predicting a radical Islamic empire, telling Jews to stop apologizing. It's powerful stuff.
It is incredibly powerful, but the structure right now, it's actually working against the message. The gravity gets a bit lost. So let's start with how the arguments are grouped.
Okay. I've read through this a couple of times. And, when you have a source like this, a man with over a century of lived history, the instinct is just to let him talk, right?
Of course.
Just let the tape roll. You want that raw, unfiltered testimony.
That's a totally natural instinct. But in this draft, it's creating a real issue with, I think, listener focus. The material oscillates really rapidly between these profound, heavy historical warnings and then these very specific, almost emulation, cultural grievances.
And that dilutes the main point.
It really does. It dilutes the impact.
I'm not sure if I'd say dilutes. Isn't that stream of consciousness style part of the point? It's authentic. He's connecting these daily frustrations with his historical trauma. That's kind of how people think, isn't it?
Authentic, yes, I'll give you that. But is it persuasive? That's the real question. We're not editing a biography here. We're editing to build an argument.
Okay.
I mean, look at the flow. He goes from this existential threat of a radical Islamic empire and the lessons of the Holocaust.
Right.
And then, boom, he's complaining about the Guinness World Records not accepting Israeli entries. And then it's straight on to the Eurovision Song Contest.
See, but I get that. He's using them as examples of bias. He's trying to show that the world is turning on him at every level, from the UN all the way down to a record book.
They are valid examples. I'm not questioning their validity. But putting them right next to discussions of, mass survival, it creates this incredible tonal whiplash. Just think about the listener. You're leaning in, listening to this terrifying prediction about the fall of Western civilization, and then 30 seconds later, we're talking about a pop song contest. It almost trivializes the bigger warning.
So it creates a boy who cried wolf kind of.
Exactly. The listener, especially a younger one, a more skeptical one, might just downgrade the severity of the whole empire prediction because it feels like it's in the same category as a cultural boycott.
So it's a hierarchy problem. It makes it sound like he's weighing the Eurovision snub with the same gravity as a major geopolitical shift.
That's the danger. It comes across as scattered. A list of complaints, not a cohesive indictment of global indifference.
A forensic analysis?
Right. So the fix, I think, is to restructure this. We need to move from the micro-symptoms to the macro-diagnosis instead of weaving them together.
Okay, so clustering them. But don't you risk the micro stuff sounding a bit, boring if you just lump it all together at the start?
Not if you frame it right. The editor should start by clustering those cultural exclusions together. Present the Guinness thing, the Eurovision threats, not as just complaints, but as the evidence. This is the soft isolation that always comes before the harder persecution.
I see. So you use them as a bridge.
Use them as the bridge to the 1930s comparison. You basically argue that this kind of social ostracization, getting kicked out of a song contest, it mirrors the very early stages of Nazi exclusion from sports and the arts.
And then you pivot.
Then, once you've laid that groundwork, you pivot to the much heavier geopolitical prediction of this Islamic empire. You build the case. You don't just throw all the evidence on the table at once.
It becomes a narrative. First they come for your culture, then they come for your civilization. That definitely hits harder.
And it helps with that section on the youth. Right now, his critique of the younger generation, it just feels a bit like an old man yelling at clouds moment.
Yeah, a little bit. They're all superficial. They're on social media too much.
But if we separate that from the geopolitics, or better yet, use it specifically to explain why the world ignores these warning signs.
Because of a lack of historical education.
Exactly. Then it stops being a general complaint, and it becomes part of the diagnosis of societal decay. It serves the argument.
Okay, that brings us to the prediction itself. The empire. The piece says the rise of a radical Islamic empire is inevitable. He's so certain about this.
He is. But that prediction, it's delivered as an absolute certainty, but it doesn't have the argumentative scaffolding needed to persuade someone who's skeptical.
Are we being too harsh there, though? I mean, he does cite the fall of Rome and Greece. He says empires fall. That's a pretty standard historical trope. People get that.
People get the trope, sure, but do they accept its application to this exact moment? He just asserts we are now living at the beginning of the Islamic Empire and that Europe is being flooded.
Right.
For a modern audience, especially the younger people he's trying to warn, that can just sound like a demographic generalization, not a real historical analysis.
You mean it could come across as xenophobic? There are too many of them here.
That's exactly how it could land if we don't build the scaffolding. He's relying on the outcome, the fall, without explaining the mechanism of the fall. He just says, Rome fell, we're next. But why did Rome fall? How does that actually map to today?
He does touch on economics, doesn't he? He mentions the inflation in 1929. People with suitcases of money. Is that the thread you'd pull on?
That's the crucial thread. To make this stronger, the piece needs to explicitly connect the mechanics of how empires collapse to what's happening now.
Okay.
So instead of just saying Rome fell, you elaborate on what caused it to fall. Economic mismanagement, currency devaluation, deep internal divisions.
And then you map those specific things to what he's observing in Western governments today.
Exactly. The argument shouldn't be the West is falling because there are Muslims in Europe. That's weak. The argument should be the West is economically fragile and spiritually hollow, just like late-stage Rome, and that's creating a power vacuum.
And that vacuum is being filled by a more assertive, unified ideology.
Now, that is a much more sophisticated argument. It transforms it from, like you said, a demographic complaint into a structural critique of Western weakness.
It grounds the prophecy in something that sounds like political science.
Right. It makes the empire prediction feel like an inevitability based on data, not just on fear. Without that, you lose the skeptic on line one. They'll just write him off as an alarmist.
Okay, let's talk about the call to action then, because if the West really is falling, his advice is to fight. But I felt a huge disconnect here.
Go on.
Well, Bingham tells the listener stop apologizing and that Jews must actually literally fight. But then in the same breath, he's critiquing the younger generation for being on social media. He seems to hate the very tool that his target audience uses for, well, everything.
It's a total contradiction, isn't it? He says they're superficial because they're on their phones, but their phones are exactly where this battle he's talking about is being fought.
Yeah.
Just telling a Gen Z listener to fight or to keep their mezuzah on their door. I mean, it can feel abstract or purely defensive.
And what does he mean by actually literally fight? Is there a risk he means, physical fighting?
It's ambiguous, and ambiguity is the enemy of action. If he means physical self-defense, fine. The edit needs to clarify that. But if he wants to reach a broad audience, we have to bridge that generational gap. We have to define what fighting looks like in 2026.
On the mediums they actually use.
Exactly. We have to respect that.
So we need to translate fight into post. I don't know, doesn't that feel a bit reductive? Does posting on Twitter really count as fighting back against a rising empire?
In an age of information warfare, yes, absolutely it does. But the edit needs to frame it that way. We need to challenge his critique of social media by framing the fight within that space. The message isn't get off your phone. It's weaponize your phone.
I like that. So what does that look like in practice? Don't apologize as a mindset, not really a behavior.
So we give concrete examples. Suggests that not apologizing on TikTok or Instagram is the modern equivalent of what he's asking for. Give an example of a modern apology.
You mean like when a student posts in support of Israel, but they add a dozen caveats? I support Israel's right to exist, but obviously I hate the government, and I condemn the violence, and...
That's it exactly. That is the apologetic mindset he is critiquing. The edit should point that out explicitly. Show how to strip that language away to meet his standard of fighting.
That makes it usable. A young person can literally look at their draft tweet and ask, am I apologizing right now?
I call it the digital mezuzah. Bingham talks about keeping the mezuzah on your door even when it's dangerous. The modern fight needs to be translated to the digital profile picture, to the bio, to the comment section. That's where the mezuzah hangs today. If you hide your identity online because you're scared of backlash, you're doing exactly what he's warning against.
That's a really powerful image. It modernizes the courage he's talking about. It takes it from just grandpa's advice to this is my daily reality.
But there's a darker issue here we still need to resolve, the philosophical core of the piece.
Okay.
There's this fundamental tension between his view that anti-Semitism is a permanent thing, a panacea for all ills, and his plea for the world to work together.
Yeah, that was the most confusing part for me. He explicitly says no, never, when he's asked if the world will ever understand the truth. He says anti-Semitism will always be there.
Right.
But then earlier he says the only way to reduce it is if the world unites in some kind of consortium.
It leaves the listener in a paradox. The world must unite, but the world never will understand. If you leave that contradiction just sitting there, the listener feels defeated, not motivated. Why bother fighting a fire that's destined to burn the whole house down anyway?
Maybe he's just conflicted? I mean, he's a human being. Maybe part of him wants hope, but his experience expects doom.
Oh, he's definitely conflicted. But our job as editors is to synthesize his message so it's actionable. So the suggestion here is to lean into that paradox. Frame the whole thing as a survivalist narrative, not a reformist one.
Okay, break that down for me. Survivalist versus reformist.
A reformist narrative says, if we just explain our side clearly enough, the world will eventually change its mind. Bingham seems to completely reject that idea. He says the world won't change.
Right.
So we stop giving feedback on how to educate the world. That's not the goal. Instead, we frame the goal as outlasting the empire.
So the actionable advice isn't change their minds, it's strengthen our own defenses.
Precisely.
You pivot the feedback to focus on his point about Israel being the only true refuge. If the world won't change, then the action item isn't to educate the nations. It's to strengthen the fortress.
That actually clarifies why he's so dismissive of diaspora Jews. He basically tells them to pack their bags while they still can. It felt harsh, almost cruel.
It is harsh, but it's totally consistent with a survivalist worldview. So the piece needs to clearly state that his hope lies only in Israel, not in changing the minds of other nations. Making that distinction sharp helps the listener know where to direct their energy.
So the message becomes, stop wasting energy trying to get the UN to like. They never will. Use that energy to build up the walls of the refuge.
It resolves the paradox. The world won't unite, so we must unite. That's the synthesis of his message. It aligns his never with his fight. You're not fighting to win over the enemy. You're fighting just to hold your ground.
That's a much darker takeaway than your standard let's all get along kind of message.
It is darker, but it actually respects the speaker's lived experience. He watched a world refuse to be educated in the 1930s. It makes perfect sense he doesn't believe education is the cure now.
Yeah.
If you frame it as a survivalist strategy, he sounds prophetic. If you just leave it as a confusing plea for unity, he sounds, well, confused.
It really changes the entire texture of the piece. It stops being a history lesson and it starts being a strategy session.
So let's just quickly review where we've landed. We started with this transcript that has incredible, powerful raw material, but it's suffering from, structural scatter, a lack of scaffolding for its biggest claims, and a real disconnect on actionability.
Right. We talked about grouping the cultural grievances, the Eurovision stuff, all that, separate. Use them as a bridge to the bigger argument, not a distraction from it.
Then we discussed bolstering the Islamic empire theory by focusing on the economic mechanics of imperial collapse, not just demographic outcomes. That's how you win over a skeptic.
And we modernized the call to act, the fight, by introducing this idea of the digital mezuzah, fighting the information war without apologizing, instead of just dismissing social media out of hand. Play on the tape would.
We invite the listener to refine the narrative structure based on these notes and submit the work again for further review. Thanks for listening.